Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. وَالْأَسْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. By the token of time, through the ages, verily man is at loss, except those who have faith and do righteous deeds and join together in the mutual teachings of truth, patience, and constancy. Amen.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Rizina, for that beautiful recitation. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for your presence here today, and I just want to make mention of the reasons why we're here today and what the purpose of this workshop is. The plight of the Palestinian people strikes a chord with us as South Africans because we share a common history of oppression and discrimination, which makes us almost duty-bound to stand up and speak out against such an injustice. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us in the Quran, Surah 4, verse 75. And why should you not fight in the cause of Allah and of those who being weak are ill-treated and oppressed, men, women and children, whose cry is, Our Lord, rescue us from this town whose people are oppressors. Therefore, we the South African youth for Palestinian youth, together with Media Review Network, have come together in bringing this to the Knowledge Workshop into action. There has been a recent awakening in politics amongst the youth through social media, the internet, etc. And many of us are attending these marches, fundraisers, events, but have very little insight as to what is actually happening in Palestine. This workshop aims to bring the situation into perspective so that many more people will be enlightened and support the cause of the Palestinians. People need to be made aware of the fact that this is a humanitarian cause and that what is happening out there is in breach of international law. And if we remain uneducated, we cannot speak out against it. With that, I'd like to call upon Iman, who would like to say a few words.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We have all watched the shocking images on our television screens of defenseless children, women, men, and elderly being brutally bombed in Gaza as the world watches helplessly, unable or unwilling to help the victims. We have protested, phoned into radio stations, written to the media, raised funds, flash mob boycotted, cried and prayed. We pray to the Almighty Allah to ease the immense pain and suffering and need to understand why would the Israelis butcher the Palestinians without any consequences from the international community. There is no doubt that our hearts bleed for them, as with any human being with an ounce of humanity. But it is crucial that we learn more about conflict so that we can defend the cause of the Palestinians in their struggle with justice and conviction. A hadith states that a learned person is harder on the devil than 1,000 pious worshippers. And that is why we are honored to have Auntie Surya Dadu, researcher at the Media Review Network and co-author of Why Israel, The Anatomy of Zionist Apartheid, a South African Perspective. I'm confident that when we leave here after this workshop, we will know a lot more about the background of the conflict, inshallah. I call on Surya Dadu.
Jazakallah for the very kind words. different way of starting this workshop, and technology willing, let's get it going.
City of Palestine, freedom in our time. Shine, Palestine, freedom in our time. Palestine, every woman that I chase to find it to live. Shine, Palestine, struggle like a mind. Palestine, change the sentence for that. This ain't no anti-Semitic, you speak time, you let the truth bear. This ain't about superiority. The oppressive and the mission are set to unrest and don't stop in the play of the evil control of the propaganda. The word is holy. The equality is just a picture of imagination. What's the practice in this faith? Amen to I mean, despite the hearts of actors, most struggling without the heart, the light goes, I can drop back. Let it do more than stimulate. Set it straight, the way I go, to illustrate. South Africa, part of the G, who rarely is that? Israeli and part of the G, refugee dance. It's a rare word in 1976, 85, 87, choosing to drink. To be fair, we remain neutral in this side of oppression. I'm silently oppressor. We can't take over every human life. Meet the sky, meet the sky. Shine, Palestine, freedom in our time. Palestine, every point is a thing to follow each other. Shine, Palestine, struggle like a mind. Palestine. Act like you know, act like you see the disguise and the Zionist lies, playing games with lives like yes, he is way of breathing, you kind of Nazi. But no separate laws, no separate roads, no settlements of burning walls on the groves, and the farmers cry, they fall to the left and they rise back up with the rocking band. Slingshots made at the tango, when the people get pushed, then they let it push back. Push at your back, the sun does a wrong, and all those the girl, and the brothers more. Which can be the ones out again, same name on the chain. Thanks for the blood, pressure words, resistance grows. South Africa's helpless to action. Set truths to set them free, 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 free. Set truths and set them free, 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 free.
So that's where hashtag Do the Knowledge comes from, in case everybody was wondering what was with that hashtag. And that was actually two very talented Durbanites right there. The white guy was Ewok, Ian Gregory Robinson, and the other person is Raheem Kemet. And I have to say, Firoz and I are quite chuffed that our book features in a music video. I don't think there are too many authors that can claim that. So, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and well, it's almost afternoon. I was supposed to say good morning. Apologies for the late start. So, good afternoon, Pretoria, and thank you specifically to the South African Youth for Palestinian Youth for organizing this event and for having me here. I have to say I'm very proud of these young people and quite honored that they invited me. So, why are we here and what do we hope to achieve? How many of you here attended the protests that were at the Israeli embassy? And anybody else went to the one in Sandton? And I bet that you guys must have been the loudest in screaming, "Free, free Palestine," I'm sure. The question that I'd like to ask is, the question that I'd like to ask is, when we scream "Free, free Palestine," what exactly is it that we're asking Palestine to be free from? And it's not a question that most people can just simply answer like that. What is that we are asking freedom from? So clearly you're all very passionate about Palestine and the fact that there is so much of solidarity and that kind of thing, there's no doubt. But what we need right now is not just passion and not just solidarity. We also need education and we need knowledge. And that's what we're going to do today. You're not going to be an expert when you leave here today, but I hope that I leave you with a good understanding about the essential facts about Israeli apartheid, about Zionism, and what it is that Palestinians need to be freed from. So we've got a lot of ground to cover in the next few hours. Some of us still need to sort out our fantasy league teams, and others still need to get back to DSTV catch-up. Or maybe iron your hair because you didn't get a chance this morning because you had to come here so early, or something like that. So, I'm going to ask you to buckle up. Let's get going. Usually there's a certain protocol at workshops and meetings and things like that. And they always ask you to put your phone on silent and put it away and pay attention to the speaker. Well, as you've probably figured out, I'm a little bit into breaking the rules. And my protocol for this is completely different. I'm actually going to ask you to get your phones out and make sure that you're logged into Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. And have you guys updated your WhatsApp status yet? Where you are, told people who you're with, what you're doing. Because we all know that something hasn't happened if it hasn't been WhatsApped or tweeted. Right? So please feel free to do that right now. Also, what I'd like to ask you to do is to use the hashtag #DoTheKnowledge, especially if you're tweeting, so that other people can find it easily. And if you have space, tag @MRN1SA in your tweet. If you're not following MRN, please do, because the whole workshop is basically going to appear on your Twitter timeline. And you'll be able to find the resources easily. If you're Facebooking, please tag me, Surya Danu, and you can send me a friend request. I'll accept it once I get back home. And tag Media Review Network South Africa. Like the MRN page, if you don't already, so that you have access to the resources that I'm going to be using. And you probably need to have access to it pretty later on, because you know that your battery on your phone is going to die pretty soon. So, we're going to start firstly, and I'll just give you a very quick rundown of what it is that I'm going to do, what you can expect. Firstly, I'm going to look at the origins and the history of the conflict. Then we're going to look at this peace process, this lovely peace process that everybody keeps about. Then we'll look at America and its role in Israeli apartheid. We'll probably have maybe like a 10-minute break. Then we'll look at life in Palestine and Israel and understand exactly what the apartheid is there. Then I'm going to speak specifically about Gaza, issues relating specifically to Gaza, Hamas, and what's happening right now. And of course, the way forward, BDS. So, we'll get started. The origins of the conflict, and people usually ask me where did this all start, and I'll say, well, we'll start at the beginning. So I'm going to call a friend to kickstart us off on our journey. And this is a Russia Today journalist by the name of Abby Martin.
Alright guys, I know there's a lot of confusion surrounding the conflict between Israel and Palestine. In recent days, Israel has launched a massive airstrike offense against the Gaza Strip. But to really comprehend this conflict, it's helpful to understand the events that have led up to today. In the most simple of terms, it goes like this. Israel exists right here, in this spot on the eastern end of the Mediterranean. These 2 points on the map are Gaza and the West Bank, together known as Palestine. But it didn't always look like this. Following World War I, there were approximately 65,000 Jewish immigrants that had immigrated to Palestine, then under British rule. That's when Britain implemented the Balfour Declaration, which promised a Jewish homeland. Now, as Palestinians were driven out from the newly designated Jewish territory, clashes began, and they would continue for years to come. During the next decade, an additional 100,000 Jewish immigrants arrived. And yet, until the early 1930s, the Jewish population in the region remained under 17%. But that changed following the Holocaust, when international efforts to establish a Jewish homeland in the land of Palestine increased. By 1947, the UN adopted a proposal that would divide Palestine into 2 states. The Arabs were designated 43% of the land, despite the fact that they made up 2/3 of the population and owned over 92% of the land. Jews were given 56% of the land, despite being only 1/3 of the population. That's interesting math, isn't it? Well, following this announcement, Jewish leaders began occupying major Palestinian cities, expelling 300,000 Palestinians before the State of Israel was even announced in 1948, the result of which led to a military offensive by neighboring countries, which overwhelmingly objected to the establishment of Israel in the land of Palestine. But they were no match to the military superiority of the Israeli army. The Israeli military effectively cleansed much of the territory, and following the 1948 war, they encompassed 78% of Palestine. Now, although a ceasefire was declared, peace would remain a faraway thought, as now 700,000 Palestinian refugees fled into neighboring Arab states. In many ways, this was the catalyst for the escalating instability in the region. In 1967, another war led to the Israeli occupation of the remainder of historic Palestine, the land that we recognize today as the West Bank and Gaza. It became clear that while the UN and other Arab countries verbally championed the plight of the Palestinians, there would be no international effort to actually enforce their right to self-determination. And in 1987, the first Intifada took place, a rebellion by the people of Palestine. Thousands were imprisoned and over 1,000 Palestinians were killed.
So we'll have to unpack what Abby had to say in the 2 minutes and 57 seconds, which she gave us like a super fast introduction into what was going on. She's used a lot of words that I think you guys might have heard before, but maybe didn't understand. There's Balfour Declaration, Partition Plan, Nakba, Zionism, 1948, 1967. What does it all mean? So we're going to break it down. Now this is actually the hardest part of today's program. It's going to be a little slow and painful, much like Man United start to the season, but stick with me on this. One of the things that Abby said was that the State of Israel was created in 1948. But that's not when the problem in Palestine started. In 1897, a dude by the name of Theodor Herzl started a political movement called Zionism. And the aim of this movement was to secure a state for the exclusive use of European Jews only. And what was weird about Zionism was that the aim of Zionism was to form a Jewish state in a Jewish homeland. But the Zionist founders themselves were not even religious Jews. The land they chose was Palestine. And it was a choice not made for any religious reason, as they were secular Jews. In fact, Uganda in East Africa was even suggested at one point as a Jewish homeland. And Argentina. And all I have to say about Argentina is Messi is like quite thankful because Gaza could have been his country. So, how many of you have heard Israel's defenders say, this is the promised land. Jews are the chosen people, God gave us the land. I'm sure on Twitter or Facebook or somewhere you must have heard this. In fact, Zionism itself has no religious foundations whatsoever. According to the scriptures of the Torah, if the Jews obeyed all of God's commands, then only would they be given by God himself a land. And this is the Holy Land, now known as Palestine, in which they would live. If the conditions were not fulfilled, the Jewish people would be sent into exile. The conditions were not, and they were sent into exile. Jews had part of the land for the first 600 years of their existence, and then they were exiled from their land. So for the past 2,000 years or so, the Jewish people have been in a state of exile decreed by God. And this state of exile was supposed to have existed until the present day. And according to the Talmud, which is an interpretation of Jewish law, it's an essential part of Jewish belief to accept God's decree of exile. Trying to fight against it or ending it themselves, especially by force, is expressly forbidden. The task for Jews is to wait for God to send the Messiah. At that time, God alone will take the Jews out of exile and give them their homeland. So the Jewish people are actually forbidden to have their own state while awaiting the Messiah. The Zionist creation of Israel is therefore actually a violation of Jewish law. So when some Zionist tells you that God became a real estate agent and gave them the land, you should be asking them this little fact about what I've just said. What's in the Talmud and the Torah? So Zionism has nothing to do with Judaism, and criticizing Israel is not a criticism of Judaism, nor is it anti-Semitic. The other thing to note is that not all Jews are Zionists. There are actually many Jews, especially in this country, who reject Zionism. So the struggle isn't against Jews, it's against Zionists. Also, not all Zionists are Jews. So we really need to be very, very strict in making these distinctions. Another phrase that you might have heard is the land without people for people without land. In 1897, there were two Austrian rabbis who traveled to Palestine to explore the possibility of establishing their Jewish state there. They sent a telegram back to Theodor Herzl saying, the bride is beautiful, but she is married to another man. I suppose if that were to happen now, they'd probably WhatsApp Herzl and say, the chick is hot, but she's rich, something like that. The land that Palestine was hitched to was the Palestinians. But Herzl was pretty determined, and he ignored Palestine's existing occupants. And so began the uprooting of Palestinians, and Jews began settling in Palestine. A large number settled after the Holocaust in World War II, when Hitler ordered the murder of almost 6 million Jews. Not only were Jewish settlers stealing the land by forcing Palestinians off using violence, but Palestinians were being killed. They were what is termed ethnically cleansed. This means that Zionists wanted the land, but without the people. Now, Abby mentioned the Balfour Declaration, and I just want to discuss that quickly, because that's something that you hear all the time when people are arguing. So this is what the Balfour Declaration is about. After World War I, which was at the beginning of the 1900s, European states divided the Ottoman Empire. When we speak of the Ottoman Empire, I'm sort of basically referring to the Middle East. They divided it amongst themselves, and Palestine went to Britain. So right from the get-go, Britain declared support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine in the Balfour Declaration of 1917. So basically, the British gave away land that wasn't actually theirs. On the 29th of November 1947, the United Nations voted in favor of dividing Palestine. So this is where the whole partition plan thing comes into play. And as Abby explained, the Palestinians were given a small amount of land, even though they were the majority population. This ridiculous partition offer was rejected by the Palestinians. And on the 15th of May 1948, even though the Palestinians rejected the plan, the State of Israel was declared. And this is what is called the Nakba, or the catastrophe. Now, remember I had just mentioned ethnic cleansing. Well, that was basically taken to a whole new level after 1947. There were 3 gangs, basically, that led to the killing of Palestinians. There were the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Stern gang. And there's one particularly well-known massacre that I'm sure you might have heard of, but you weren't too sure where it fitted into the whole thing. And it took place on the 9th and 10th of April 1948 near Jerusalem in a village called Deir Yassin. And that is where the Deir Yassin massacre fits in, because it was one of the turning points for Palestinians. And as Abby described, during these ethnic cleansing operations, thousands were murdered, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled, hundreds of villages were destroyed. And it was all about getting the land, but without the people. This getting the land without people, it has a fancier term that is sometimes used to describe it. And I want you guys to become familiar with these terms so that when you read it, you know exactly what it means. It's called settler colonialism. And I'm going to explain it in the way in which I actually explained it to my daughter. And she's 10, so I'm pretty certain you guys will get it too. I'm from Lenasia. I apologize, I know that doesn't go down too well in Pretoria, but unfortunately, yes, I'm from Lenasia. And let's say that the people from Lenasia decided that we had enough of load shedding and not having electricity. So we're going to settle in Lodium, and we're going to take over Lodium. Now, we're not just going to settle in Lodium, we're going to take over the municipality and the businesses and everything. But we'll keep the Lodium people, because we need them as workers, so we can get richer. That is called colonialism. But let's say the Lenasia people decided not just to take over the land and the businesses, they were going to replace all the Lodium people, the original Lodium people, with new Lenasia people. So, we're basically going to change everything in Lodium. We're going to make it look like Lodium never existed. And this was, the Lodium was like Lenasia all the time. This is called settler colonialism. This is what Israel did. It moved its population into Palestine and basically tried to get rid of the Palestinians. But Israel, I just want to add, is not the only settler colonial state. America did this with the Native Americans, and Australia also did this to the Aborigines. So when you talk about settler colonialism, it's essentially about replacing the natives of that land, the original inhabitants, and basically erasing its memory, erasing everything. So Lodium never existed. This was Lenasia all along. That's basically how I would explain it to you guys. Now, during those ethnic cleansing operations, Palestinians started fleeing to what Abby showed on the map, which was the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And in June 1967, Israel conquered the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. And this came to be known as the occupied territories, or the occupied Palestinian territories. So when you hear that term, it's referring specifically to those areas, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. It also took over, in 1967, Israel took over the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt and the area known as the Golan Heights in Syria. The UN Security Council, now this is a resolution I'm sure you must have heard about lots. UN's Resolution 242. So what is 242 about? The UN Security Council Resolution 242 ordered Israel to withdraw from these conquered territories immediately. That was in 1967. Israel has only partially complied with Resolution 242. The Sinai Peninsula was returned to Egypt in 1979, but Israel still occupies the West Bank and has actually moved in 500,000 of its own citizens into the area by constructing illegal settlements. And I'll get to the issue of illegal settlements just now. Israel continues to occupy the Golan Heights in Syria, and it has also occupied parts of southern Lebanon for over 20 years. It withdrew from Lebanon in 2000, but it occupies a small strip of land called the Sheba Farms. Israel also withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005, but I'm going to be discussing that in detail later on. So for the most part, Israel has basically ignored Resolution 242. Now, some of you probably going to are thinking, how the heck am I going to remember all the stuff that she's saying? I don't have a copy of the book with me. If I pull it out, the projector goes down there. The projector's going to go. This is the book that I'm referring to. If you look in part 1 of Why Israel, all of what I've said is just there, and it's written in the way that I've just said it to you. So you can get yourself a copy and check out part 1. And in fact, for most of today, I'm going to be referring you guys to which sections in Why Israel you need to refer to. It's a pretty thick book. I know I don't expect you to read it all. But if you're trying to remember something that I told you, just go to the relevant section in the book that I am telling you to go to. So Abby took us to the first Intifada. She mentioned the first Intifada in that video, which was in 1987, where basically Palestinians were sick and tired of being occupied, and there was an uprising amongst the youth. It was essentially children with bricks against the Israeli occupation forces. And if you remember, Ewok and Rahim Kemen also mentioned that, children with bricks. The first Intifada is essentially called the Stone Throwers Intifada. And Intifada, just for everyone, it sort of loosely translates to uprising, although I think a more accurate description is like a shaking off. So when people use the term Intifada, that's basically what they're talking about. I need to thank Abby Martin for getting us to this point. You can follow Abby on Twitter, at Abby Martin. She's a journalist on Russia Today, and her programs are really, they're interesting, they're fast, they're not boring. And some of you might not be aware of this, but DSTV, the channels actually don't stop at 124 or 203. Russia Today is on channel 407. So you can actually catch Abby on Russia Today as well. If you're on Twitter, you're checking your Twitter timeline, you'll see that MRN has tweeted the link for that short Abby Martin video that I played. It also tweeted the link for Intifada Intellect. So you can go back and check those out again. And again, I'm going to say follow the hashtag Do the Knowledge to find all the tweets from today's workshop. So that's it with the history. Are you guys still with me to survive the history part of it? Because that's essentially, like I said, the hardest and the most painful part of this. Does anyone have any questions about what I've just said, relating specifically to the history and the background of Palestine? Anti-Semitism is, put very simply, the Jewish equivalent of Islamophobia. I mean, you hate someone specifically because they're Jewish. You have certain stereotypes, certain beliefs about what their religion is. It's kind of like, when somebody calls you as a Muslim, they'll call you like a sand nigger or something like that. Terrorist. It's the Jewish equivalent of that. And so there are lots of stereotypes that people say, and it's something I must speak out strongly about. I see these tweets all the time. Hitler should have finished the job. Hitler should have finished the job. I find those tweets very offensive. They're anti-Semitic. The world would have been better if they were all gassed, or something along the lines of like, those cheap Jews, or they after money, that kind of thing. So it's essentially, and it's very offensive. I mean, we wouldn't want people calling us terrorists, so I don't think we should be encouraging people bigotry and discrimination against someone based on their religion.